third and the last panel today. Now we will move on from looking at the diplomatic and the kind of military aspect of this, and now we will kind of move beyond the state and also look at the role of non-state actors and the relations between kind of public and private actors, and also the role of civil society, how they play into this. We will have to finish by 4:15 today, just to make sure that they have the time to clear up the room and everything. So we'll try and we have to cut it a little bit short. My name is Hilda Haug. I come from the University of Oslo. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in Balkan Area Studies, and I had to step in on a short notice for my colleague who could not unfortunately be here today, Carsten Friis. So I think we'll just move on from then. So the first presenter we have today is Jelle Leonis, who's a PhD student at the Free University of Brussels. And he's on a PhD fellowship from the Research Foundation of Flanders. And as his paper will also show today, his main research topic is on the democratic control of private and military security companies. He previously obtained a Master's of Arts in Philosophy at the University of Ghent. And he was rewarded the Flemish Peace Prize with a dissertation on just war and private military companies. He also has an MPhil from the Peace Studies Department at Bradford University in the UK. So I think with this first paper, then we'll start looking at this role of private military and security companies. So I think I will just give the word to you and to present your paper.
Thanks for the opportunity of presenting my paper. In fact, I'm in an early stage of my PhD research, so I want to present a theoretical framework on the concept of accountability in the governance of private military companies. This is a proposal for, in fact, the theoretical framework of my late research, and in fact, I want to discuss the accountability of private military and security companies, because these companies challenge traditional models of civil-military relations. They're used because some authors claim that they're a method to circumvent casualty aversion. They don't make it into the media headlines. They might be a method to wage war by proxy. So they challenge traditional models of democratic control of armed forces in two ways. First, they contribute to the blurring of the public and private divide, because as non-state actors, they challenge the state monopoly on violence. They act as both auspices and as providers of security provision. In the second way in which they challenge traditional models of democratic control of armed forces is that they call into question the neat distinction between civil and military parts of society. Private military company is not a term under international law, so their status under international law has to be determined on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes they are combatants, sometimes they are civilians, based on the activities they are performing in an armed conflict. After the Cold War, there was a move from traditional civil-military relations to security governance, because on one side security was broadening and deepening. There were non-state actors, and security was more than just military security. There was environmental security issues, economic security, and so on. So that's why a security governance framework has been proposed. Governance must then be considered as the coordination of interdependent needs of private and public actors in the absence of a central political authority. So, in fact, there was a move from security government to security governance. But still in the security governance framework, in my opinion, some questions remain. Namely, a security governance framework does not adequately answer whose security is promoted and what kind of security is promoted, and under whose supervision that security is promoted. So I want to propose a shift from security governance to nodal security governance. In fact, the nodal security governance model has been developed in criminological literature, and for me, the nodal element, the addition of the nodal element, is a heuristic device to answer the above the questions I just mentioned. Nodal governance draws upon network theory, and nodes are the sites in a network where the lines of the network intersect. Nodes can be considered as institutionalized sites of governance. So a node is characterized by the convergence of four elements. First of all, they are more or less institutionalized sites of governance, characterized by a way of thinking or a mentality. They use a set of methods or technologies to govern the area they're supposed to govern, and therefore they're supported by resources from different agents. So I want to apply the nodal security governance to the governance of private military companies. Private military companies have arisen in a mentality of neoliberalism. In the 1980s, there was a reconfiguration of the relationships between state and individuals, and security was considered to be seen as a private responsibility. This can be considered as a desecuritization move, in my opinion, because from a state responsibility, security moved to a private responsibility. In fact, I'm still struggling with the argument if private military and security companies can be seen as epistemic communities who contributed to this shift from state to private responsibility. So in the governance of private military and security companies, those companies are governed by contracts. And for me, contracts can be considered as the institutionalized nodes. Contracts are the private agreement on an exchange of resources, and security is thus provided where an agreement is reached on an exchange of financial resources on the one side and human and technological resources provided by the security company on the other. But this tends to be, it's difficult to monitor from a democratic point of view. So in this framework, accountability can be considered as a method or a technique to maintain influence, to maintain democratic influence over private military and security companies. Accountability is a social relationship between an actor and a forum. An account is given through concrete practices. For accountability to be democratic, so to ensure democratic control of private military and security companies, the ultimate account is to be given to Parliament as the ultimate principle. Policy making in a parliamentary democracy can be seen as a chain of delegation from the citizens to government and all sorts of governmental agencies. So to ensure democratic oversight, a reverse chain of accountability should mirror the chain of delegation. I have tried to apply this framework to private military and security governance in the European Union. As a case study, we can conclude that currently no comprehensively integrated framework on private military and security companies exists, so they are governed on a case-by-case basis. Either they offer their services inside European borders or they offer their services outside these borders. Inside the borders, they're basically governed by the freedoms of establishment and of service provision, because there is no sector-specific regulation, because the Commission thought there was no major market malfunctioning. This means that the private security companies are considered as a normal economic sector, and the Court of Justice of the European Union has made this opinion clear in its case law. So the implications for national regulation of private military companies is that national regulation cannot hinder those basic freedoms. If a private military security company offers a service in one member state, another member state cannot require extra administrative authorizations or mustn't give an extra authorization. Private military and security companies outside the European Union, they fall under the framework of the Common Foreign and Security Policy. The governance is fragmented and ad hoc, and if private military and security companies export their services, they fall under different arms exports regulations, so there is no specific regulation for those companies. In fact, they have to apply for an export license based on the arms exports regulations. They have to apply to national governments. So there might be a potential competition between member states to issue these licenses, and the role of national parliaments in this license system is limited because they are informed by the executive. The executive, in fact, issues those licenses, and national parliaments are informed on a basis determined by the executive. In common security and defense policy missions, so under supervision of the European Union in outside EU borders, they're in principle governed through intergovernmental decision making, but in practice, the political and security company acts as a script writer of CSDP missions, and this leads to supranational intergovernmentalism. So, in fact, in principle, CSDP missions are decided upon intergovernmentally, but the political and security company, as an epistemic community, can act as a supranational institution. And in fact, the decisions to use private military and security companies in outside EU territory falls to EU delegations on the ground, and the political and security committee is only informed of its use. So we can conclude in this instance that the role of the European Parliament is limited to information and consultation. National parliaments are should be informed because of the intergovernmental basis of the common foreign and security policy, but this information is on an ad hoc and basis decided upon by the executive. So as a conclusion, the parliaments, as the ultimate democratic arbiter, are only involved on an ad hoc basis, and the executive branch of government, so the executive determines the modality of the information provision to Parliament. This undermines national parliamentary control, and on the other side, in the case of the European Union, the European Parliament does not take over this role. So the nodal governance framework, in fact, allows us to conclude that accountability falls mainly to the contracting parties, and the democratic control is determined on ad hoc basis, mainly by the executive. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so we move on now from looking at this the contracting kind of aspect of this, and to look at also two more empirical based research on the relations between civil society and policing in a comparative study between Northern Ireland and Bosnia. So our next speaker is Branka Marian, who is a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. And Branka, she's working on a dissertation that concentrates on peace-building initiatives and local citizenship practices in Bosnia and Northern Ireland. And she spent also some time, I think, as I understood, in Northern Ireland, in North Belfast, doing some of her fieldwork. And her broader research interests are focused on, more generally, on peace building, security, citizenship, and civil society in post-conflict countries. So I think I will just leave the word to you and to present your paper.
Sure, sounds good. So basically, today we've talked a lot about different kinds of actors. And we've mentioned to a certain extent civilian actors and the need for civil society to be better aware of the types of security changes and reforms that are occurring. But we haven't touched on the group that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is the civil society sector as such. The literature also is in agreement with a lot of what has been said today, that civil society has the potential to both monitor the reforms, but also ensure that there are more reforms by providing oversight mechanisms and sort of providing the next steps in terms of the reforms. So I came to this research sort of asking, well, to what extent is this true in the cases of Bosnia and Northern Ireland? The rationale for the case selection is that, well, Northern Ireland became an example of at least a qualified success for many subsequent police reforms. And indeed, Christopher Patten, who was one of the main sort of drafters of a document called the Patten Report, in terms of reforming policing in Northern Ireland, that sort of was seen, you know, this is the sort of way to do police reform. But let me give you sort of two examples from my field research, which I think will illustrate the types of issues that emerge when you sort of start suggesting that civil society becomes involved in policing, in the security sector in general. And both examples are from Northern Ireland, because there's so many Balkan specialists, so it's always safer to start further away. But I was in Londonderry doing a research interview, and my interviewee stopped and said, you know, I have to take this phone call because there has been a death threat. And at this point, I was thinking it was a really good idea to leave this interview, but I stayed, and I'm glad I did, because what I saw was something that we haven't discussed, and that is that this peace-building organization and this individual came to act as an intermediary between the community, which was very skeptical of policing because of the legacy of the Northern Irish conflict, and the police. So there was an individual, young individual in the Republican community who had gotten a death threat from one of these sort of leftovers of the IRA who have taken it on themselves to do community policing. And I'll explain further what, you know, usually we mean by community policing. And so this individual came to act as an intermediary, and he was going to be the one that was going to contact the police and sort of do this role. So this was interesting. This was different because you would ask yourself, why not just go to the police yourself? You know, if you've received a death threat, just call the police. But if you know anything of the Northern Irish conflict, you know that in the Republican communities, the police isn't seen as favorably. So the other example, which I think is equally fascinating, and I found myself surrounded by individuals who are members of the former paramilitary organizations. And there's sort of a sentiment of, you know, they haven't gone away, right? Even though the IRA has disarmed and all of this has happened, these kinds of groups still play a significant role in the oversight of their communities. And what happened there, what I witnessed, was an exchange where these paramilitary groups were sort of coordinating you know, whether or not an individual who was suspected of being involved in some murders of army officers in Northern Ireland, whether or not he could come up to Belfast. And this was interesting because, I mean, this is what the police should be doing, right? This isn't something that you want the paramilitary guys to be deciding amongst themselves. So what comes out of these two examples? Well, one is, yes, the civil society can play a significant role. They can act as an intermediary, and indeed in Northern Ireland, they have played a great role in ensuring that policing reforms do get carried on. And, you know, we've talked about this today. How do you trickle down to the sort of the low levels, right? How do you trickle down to the community sectors? And this is one way to do it, is through civil society organizations which educate, which sort of promote policing in community forums and do all of these different types of things. But the other example, I think, is a clear example, you know, illustrates how this kind of civil society involvement is not necessarily always positive, and how it can in fact undermine sort of the reforms and undermine the legitimacy of the policing service that, you know, you think that civil society would actually in fact support. So I think those two examples are important, because what you really want civil society to do in policing reforms is to provide the street level legitimacy, which it often lacks. So in the case of Northern Ireland, the police legitimacy isn't there in the Republican communities, because something like 92% of the police service, as it was known, the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Northern Ireland, up until the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, was Protestant, right? So it wasn't seen as representative of the community. So of course you had to reform that. But reforms don't, you know, we talked a lot about technical reforms, and what policing reform is really good at doing is technical aspects, you know, training, sort of trying to ensure more representation. And this is in fact what they did in Northern Ireland. This is where they've been really successful to a certain extent, because, you know, in 2011, this sort of positive kind of discrimination to recruit more Catholics into the police service ended. And that ended with, you know, some 30% of the police service of Northern Ireland now being actually Catholic. But it's still very difficult to recruit and also to keep Catholic police officers because particularly of these sentiments and these mentalities and these legacies of the conflict. And a lot of what people will remark upon in Northern Ireland, of people of older generations, is that they don't understand where the negative image of the police comes from, because it can't come, you know, amongst youth in Republican areas, because they were too young to actually remember the RUC. So this has to be coming from the older generations, right? This has to be coming from the parents, because these younger generations have now grown up with the PSNI, which is certainly, you can call it a qualified success in terms of reforms. Bosnia is, of course, as always, more complicated because the issue in Bosnia is that not only do you have to have such structural reforms, and you have to, of course, have the philosophy, you have to have philosophical reforms, because community policing and this kind of involvement of civil society is something that is relatively new to the Balkans in general because of our history and because of the previous political system, but it also because of the conflict that occurred. So, you know, the police, after the conflict in Bosnia, something like 70% of the police were sort of estimated to have engaged in human rights violations of citizens. So what you needed to do, in addition to all the political divides and all the ethnic divides and all the atrocities that had occurred, you also needed to now build trust in the community, in this sort of this policing. So several international organizations, as well as several sort of countries, have been really involved in pushing policing reform in Bosnia alongside other security sector reforms. Police reform is still seen, and I think quite rightly, as being unfinished and as not being the successful, right? Well, you know, it is questionable the extent to which defense reform in Bosnia is successful. It is presented as a successful case, but it's certainly more successful than the police reforms. Everyone agrees on this. So why do people think that, you know, policing in Bosnia hasn't been reformed? Well, there's an issue of different jurisdictions. For example, every canton in the Federation has their own police service. So, you know, you can sort of run into problems where there is little cooperation from, let's say, the canton that I come from, Canton 10, and, you know, the cantons in Sarajevo in that area. And then, of course, the RS, the Serb Republic, has its own police, which is a bit easier because it is more centralized, right? But then also the Brčko district has its own. police. And then, of course, all of these people have their own ministries of interior. So the reforms were carried out to ensure that there would be some, state-level oversight, that, there would be kind of police for the whole, and, both the entity and the Serb Republic, as well as the Brčko district. And this, to some extent, does exist. But the question in Bosnia really is the extent to which you can have, sort of these kind of new novel approaches to policing, such as community policing, which have been pushed forward. And civil society organizations are very few and far between in Bosnia that work on security sector issues. One of the gentlemen is actually here today who actually does this, and he's one of the very few. There are very few organizations that understand the extent of the security reforms that have occurred, that can do the monitoring and that can do the oversight. So the sort of thicker kind of involvement of civil society, which is pushed for, is simply not visible in Bosnia. But the biggest issues for civil society involvement in security sector reforms in Bosnia is, in fact, that a lot of these organizations depend on donor funding, and donor funding is driven by projects. So, for example, these last couple of years there has been a lot of focus on the Roma population in Bosnia. So that means all the other projects of monitoring, policing reform and security sector reform more broadly have sort of fallen to the wayside because there simply isn't the money to do that. So these kinds of now new approaches of trying to build sort of a sense of community policing, where the community really does feel comfortable coming in contact with the police, are being pushed forward. These, to some extent, have been successful in the sort of the couple cases where they've occurred, but the real difficult issue is in sort of changing the mentalities surrounding such novel ideas of policing. Because in Bosnia, and I would make the case, I think, successfully, that in much of the Balkans, there is still the concept of, do not make waves, or as we say, ne talasaj, right? Which simply means, don't rock the boat, And the biggest issue, actually, in fact, with sort of trying to encourage, these kinds of changes, is that, in fact, you have to change the mentality surrounding, for example, corruption. Because you have to make people aware that they are also, if they're, giving the money to the police so that he doesn't write them a ticket, if they give them 20 convertible marks, that's actually a crime itself. So sort of encouraging and supporting civil society reforms in policing entails a broader change of mentalities and approaches, which was surprising for me, which I found, which wasn't just on the policing side of it, but also on the community side of it, which will be a bit more difficult to explain and write up to my supervisor. But what is really crucial here, and what I hope that I've stressed and that I haven't taken too much of your time, is that, in fact, the kind of legitimacy that we hope to achieve with civil society isn't really being achieved as such, because the capabilities in the case of Bosnia simply aren't there. In Northern Ireland, you have all these other actors which haven't gone away, which still play a huge role in sort of the understanding of policing. So despite the fact that Northern Ireland is much better and much more successful at the policing reforms than Bosnia, what remains in Northern Ireland is still a lot of confusion of what is community policing. What does it mean to have civil society oversight and involvement? Yes, there are forums where the police meet with the citizens, or these forums also exist in Bosnia. There's something like which the police do not look favorably upon, going to the movies with the police officers, which the police just find, especially in the Balkans, they find this completely, out of left field. They don't understand why such things should occur. But the key issue that we really must tackle is, what do we mean by civil society? Can civil society achieve the types of things that we want it to achieve in terms of improving legitimacy, given the political context? I haven't gone into the political context of Bosnia, because that could take, I think, all of the whole conference that we have for the next 4 or 5 days, given the different levels and complexities and nuances within it. But can civil society, can these new transformations occur given the different legacies of the conflict, given the complexities? And my argument simply is that it's not achievable to the extent that we perhaps think it is, that there are many obstacles, but there are also many, of course, possibilities. There are slight transformations, and the philosophy of policing, that the transformation in that we've seen in both cases should not be undermined. There has been a lot that has been achieved, but in fact, so much remains to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marian. Okay, so then we will move on from policing and kind of move back again maybe more to this, to the public-private kind of relationship. So Peter Gale, he will outline his model of securitism that builds on the recent network literature and also on older literature on this corporatism, and in order to analyze the main kind of permutations within the state corporate sovereignty nexus. And I think I will introduce you first of all. So Peter Gale, he's an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Liverpool, and you've previously worked as a research professor in intelligence studies at the University of Salford. He's also the author of a number of books, including Policing Politics from 1994, Rounding Up the Usual Suspects from 2000. He's also been co-author of Intelligence in the Insecure World and a number of other publications. And his current research is very much now focused on the democratization of intelligence in former authoritarian regimes. And he was also awarded the Leverhulme Emeritus Fellowship in 2010. So I think in a way you kind of tie together aspects of both your papers, looking both at the kind of corporate, the state-private relationship, but you also touch on this issue of the role of kind of paramilitaries and those kind of groups that are, we can discuss later whether these are actually civil society actors or not, so that would be an interesting discussion. So I will just let you present your paper.
Thank you very much. Okay, firstly, thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation, and a second, and perhaps an even more gratitude expressed that you put me on in the afternoon rather than at 9 o'clock this evening. The context for what I'm talking about this afternoon is a work in progress. As Hilda said, I'm working on a project looking at intelligence democratization or not in former authoritarian regimes, certainly in this region, and it's a pleasure to be back in Belgrade, but also elsewhere. So I'm also looking at some countries in Latin America with a view to a comparison. Now, clearly, as everybody in this room knows, to the extent that intelligence has been looked at as an aspect of security sector reform, and it's been looked at far less than police or military, it's been looked at in terms of state intelligence services, and for very obvious reasons. We're talking about regimes in which they used to be highly repressive. They were the core of authoritarianism or totalitarianism, so not surprisingly we're concerned with their reform. But I am concerned also, partly building on actually what coincidentally Jelle and Branko have said, firstly with the development, as Jelle pointed out, since the Cold War of the private security sector on the one hand, and secondly, and perhaps slightly more, perhaps controversially in some cases, the existence of what we might describe as parastates. There are different words used to describe this phenomenon, which Mike Warner has defined as groups who use violence to control people, resources, or territory. And we're talking about paramilitaries, national liberation movements, militias, criminal organisations, a range of what in some cases might be considered aspects of civil society, and in other cases aspects of uncivil society. Now again, linking clearly with what Jelle was talking about, his notion of nodal security governance, I would say what's really interesting and very important for us to understand in the world of intelligence now is the extent to which these three sectors, state, corporate, parastate, often have major links. They do so, I suggest, for two main reasons. One is because they have a whole series of material interdependencies in terms of personnel, technologies, access to sources, and so on. Think the US National Security Agency, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, etc., as a recent example. They also share ideological consensus around security needs. They may have slight variations, but basically there is that. And for these two reasons, the relationships between these three different sectors are extensive. So just to give one or two examples, the state-corporate relationships vary, but they're normally cooperative. In other words, the state outsources, it may vet personnel, it advises security companies, and it buys their equipment, as some examples. On the other hand, what the corporations do, they lobby the state about policy, they lobby for regulation or reduce or minimise regulation if there is any, and they try to sell their products and services. So there's two-way relationship there. States also have relationship with parastates. Now these may be entirely cooperative or they may be very conflictual. So for example, in different circumstances, states may assist parastates. They may subcontract violence. So to take an example, reminded by Branka talking about Northern Ireland, in the case of the UK, the British Army at the time of the Troubles was over a number of years outsourcing assassinations to loyalist paramilitary squads. And we now have, this is well documented now. So there may be cooperation, but equally, in other contexts, states seek to repress parastates. They put them under surveillance. They want to repress them. They want to kill them, or they want to capture them and lock them up. So in other words, in different circumstances, the relationship is very different. As between parastates and corporations, again, there are a series of potential relationships. Parastates may well want to sell their services to corporations. There are a whole range of areas in the world in which corporations provide their own security, but if they don't provide their own security, they hire local militias to provide security for them. Examples from Africa abound, Shell in Nigeria and so on. On the other hand, parastates may also offer protection or run protection rackets against corporations. Nice little petroleum institution you've got here, wouldn't like to see anything nasty happen to it, would you? And you pay us and we'll guarantee nothing nasty will happen to it, and so on. Equally, corporations therefore may hire, they might subcontract to parastates, or again, of course, because they're making products and services, they might just sell to them. But here I want to, in a sense, move on from what Jelle was saying, because the idea of networks doesn't quite do justice to the actual, or I would say potential integration of these different sectors. And this is where building on the one hand on network theory, and on the other hand, what to some, I suspect, possibly older members of the audience might remember this concept in the dim, distant past of corporatism, which I've slightly resurrected. I suspect there's a lot of young people here who think corporatism, never heard of it, in which case see me afterwards and I'll try and explain. But it seems to me this is a rather useful way of them producing this, I mean it's a horrible word, securitism, but by this I mean the symbiotic, and that's an important word, symbiotic integration of states, corporations and sometimes parastates in making and implementing security policy. Why do I say that this is a much more, there is this integration rather than just the networks that Jelle was talking about? Well, firstly, obviously in this area we're talking about the very distinctive presence of secrecy. Secondly, there's the material independence I've also already referred to. Modern states cannot implement security policy on their own. They simply don't have the equipment. 30 years ago, states developed, let's say for signals intelligence, states developed, knew exactly what they wanted and specified what they wanted people to make them. But now they are, they have much closer relationships, they're much more dependent on security companies producing IT and so on. Many states post-Cold War can't afford to use people for intelligence purposes or coercive purposes. They hire private security companies and so on. Then, as I say, there is the ideological consensus as well. But in some cases, of course, parastates carry out very important functions which come close to what we describe as security governance. Parastates in some areas, some geographical areas, and historically in some areas within this region, clearly, perhaps less true now, but perhaps not entirely untrue, carry out security functions, extraction functions, they tax people, they regulate their behaviour, and again, just going, sorry, I can't go back to Branca's example, I mean, this is exactly what she was talking about, with the so-called real IRA and its continuing community policing, which is a form of regulating and punishing the local community. It's a parastate. So it's the integration of this which is clearly highly problematic for us of us concerned with the possibilities for democratic control. Earlier today I heard someone mention, sorry, again, I think possibly Jelle mentioned, within security sector we're familiar with Weber's good old idea about the definition of the state in terms of its monopoly of legitimate coercion. And this is very crucial, and it's an important part of this whole debate about the extent to which private security companies do infringe on that monopoly or not. But think about this in terms of intelligence. There is no intelligence monopoly. No state has the capacity or the will to suppress non-state intelligence. Think about companies. All companies gather intelligence in terms of them, what used to be called market intelligence is now often called competitive or business intelligence. All companies do that, whether they're security companies or not. The other reason why, of course, the states have no interest in trying to regulate this is that corporations' interests in gathering their own intelligence are central to the health of neoliberalism, the health of liberal capitalism, to the fiscal base, to national wealth. In other words, there's no way states are going to try and curtail corporations using intelligence. Secondly, when it comes to parastates, again, this is more contingent on the circumstances. In some spatial areas, parastates will be the main source or the main gatherer of intelligence about what is happening in terms of security. We see this, for example, particularly in borderlands, where the writ of even Westphalian states begins to weaken. And in those borderland areas, often it will be forms of traffickers who will probably have the most effective intelligence capacity. So what we've got is corporations and parastates in some cases constituting what Charles Tilly in his book on democratisation refers to as autonomous power centres, which inhibit state capacity. They also may subvert the public interest and undermine the establishment of democratic governments. Now, is there anything we can do about this? Looking at the possibility of democratic control in terms of these three sectors, very briefly, what can we note? With respect to state intelligence, clearly a lot of progress has been made in the last quarter century, in my country as in yours, in terms of legalising what intelligence agencies do by means of statutes, and providing forms of oversight by judicial, from judges, by parliamentary committees, and in some cases we of course experience that informally from civil society. Is this adequate? Is it fully developed? No, it's not. Even in the United Kingdom, an older democracy than the ones in this region, the inadequacies of our intelligence oversight have been ruthlessly exposed by the failure of our parliamentary committee over the extraordinary rendition saga, for example. We learned virtually nothing about what was going on there from the Intelligence and Security Committee. We learned much more from different sources. What about corporations? Well, I don't need to go in because Jelle has already described the highly inadequate legal context for accountability by private security companies. Some people argue that things like the potential for reputational damage provides some potential check on the activity of corporations, and if we look at the various name changes that Blackwater, then Z, and then whatever they then went through in an attempt to kind of rescue their reputation from the gutter, may give some evidence for that. But the numbers of these corporations and the closeness of their relationship with states mean that I think this check is clearly not adequate. Now, it might seem wholly bizarre to even talk about notions of democratic control when it comes to parastates. How can there be democratic control? But clearly, I think something we have to note here, and this is something, I don't know, you may want to follow this up in question, but this is something I've been alerted to by some work I did a few years ago with an anthropologist. And since when I've read some more contributions on the security issue by anthropologists, and they give us a very different view, which I think is very interesting, that we have to take on board the notion of competing legitimacies. We are used to the notion of developing Westphalian states and Weber and legitimacy and authority and all that sort of thing. But where does this come from? Does it only come from elections? Well, in many areas, no, it doesn't. It comes for a variety of other reasons. It may become through clan loyalties, tribal loyalties, and other forms. And these competing legitimacies do mean that in some areas, the state is challenged. And it's not necessarily a wholly undesirable thing. It may be crude, there won't be much obedience to the European Convention on Human Rights, but in some areas that's the way it is, and we disturb that, I think, at our peril. We might seek accommodation with certain parastates, or we may seek to incorporate aspects of parastates. So there are examples where, of course, post-authoritarian regimes, very interestingly, former intelligence officers of insurgent groups have been incorporated into state intelligence agencies. South Africa is the best example of that. Okay, in conclusion, clearly there are major problems with the state governance or the governance of state intelligence. We know there are residues of authoritarianism, it's fragmented, it gets outsourced and decentralized. It's very hard to control and oversee. But, and here's I think the rub, only states can secure the resources and provide for some reasoned debate and protect a notion of the general public interest. And therefore, it's necessary to develop state capacity, including to regulate private companies, to suppress highly uncivil parastates, and simultaneously to enhance our oversight of the state. In other words, there is perhaps an apparent paradox here of our need to increase state capacity, I'm arguing, while increasing our oversight of its activities. But this is actually the core of democratic control of intelligence, and that's what we need to seek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, so then we move on to our last paper for this afternoon. And this is given by Ida Orzechowska, who is the PhD candidate at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Wrocław in Poland, where she's aiming to obtain a degree in political science and sociology. And she will now move the focus a little bit back to the Western Balkans and to this kind of eastern region. And she has her main research interests also relate, as for the others, to international security, but more specifically to the Western Balkans and to conflict studies. So currently, as I understand, you're also a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Balkans at the Goldsmiths University of London, where you are developing part of your dissertation in correlation with some of your advisors there. And you're looking at the correlation between power relations and stability in the Western Balkan region. And if I understand right, you also worked quite a lot with the region before as an independent researcher, so you have good knowledge of this area, and you've published quite also a number of papers in different journals here. So I think again, you're also looking at this public-private partnerships, and so you're kind of seeking to fill that kind of gap in the scholarship, looking at what their role is in the Western Balkans and also in Central European countries. So I will just give the word to you.
Thank you, Hilda. And just before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for establishing already a tradition in Belgrade of the academic event and the BSF. So I can see Sonia here. I saw Philip somewhere in the back. I can see Isidora. So thank you a lot, and all the best for the future of the BSF. Yeah, as Hilda said, I will talk about the private-public partnership, the concept of public-private partnership in the security sector. And as far as the academic debate in general on the privatization of security is a quite well-developed one, my impression is that we all tend to discuss the same topics over and over again from different perspectives, and we leave some of the topics, some of the ideas ignored and understudied. And the PPP concept, so the private-public partnership concept in security sector, remains one of the most understudied ideas in modern security studies. Therefore, I would like to make several points on the development of PPP in security sector in Central and Eastern and Southeastern European countries. And just to make it clear, this research is not a part of my dissertation or PhD studies. This is a pilot study for a bigger research project that will actually be developed as a private-public partnership research project. Let me start with some few methodological remarks. This research was mainly based on primary sources, on in-depth semi-structured interviews with representatives of public bodies, private actors, and representatives of international organizations. And the fact that we based the research on primary sources results, on the one hand, from the obvious fact that it's just more interesting than basing a research on only secondary sources. But on the other hand, this is a result of the fact that there is very, very few secondary research, resources on PPP in security sector, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And this is additionally complicated by the fact that a lot of national statistical offices do not have or do not include any research codes for PPP or even private security services in their research, so it's just impossible to compare some results or some data. And then the final methodological remark I need to make is, refers to the question of definition, because as far as in economic studies, or whatever we want to call it, PPP is a pretty clearly understood idea. However, when it gets to security and the sensitive field of security, it becomes somehow blurry and is very often confused with other solutions. So just to highlight the very crucial elements of the definition of PPP, a PPP should be understood as an arrangement between or in which a private sector participates in the supply of assets and services that were traditionally provided by the government. However, the critical element of the definition is that PPP is, unlike outsourcing, for example, a risk sharing and a responsibility sharing partnership or cooperation in which the concept of common objectives or common or shared ideas is very, very central. The major remark when it comes to development trends in the PPP area in Central and Eastern Europe, there should be like two most important remarks made. The first one is that development trends represent a very, very big similarity to the development trends we could have observed in Western Europe or in the US in the past 2 to 3 decades. However, the level of public acceptance and the level of implementation of the projects is significantly lower, and we still have a long path to go before we reach the level of England, for example, where about 75% of public security infrastructure is developed within a PPP project framework. And the second remark we should make when it comes to development trends is the fact that as the development of PPP idea or the cooperation idea and the inclusion of many more non-traditional security actors into security sector can be perceived as a linear, natural process and the response to the changing security environment. The respondents of the study, they all underline that the governments in Central and Eastern European countries have to face some challenges that were never present in the Western countries, Western European countries, and the US. And there are four most important challenges that occurred in the research. The first one is the big-scale disapproval in the area of security in the socialist times. The second one are the challenges related to the financial and conditionality mechanisms of the EU. The third one is the low skills of civil servants in general in the area of investments. And the final one is the highly politicized process of privatization that the countries have experienced. The traditional way of thinking about actors involved in PPP assumes that there are two parties of the partnership, the private one and the public one, which is quite obvious. However, the research, the interviews shows that since the financial crisis of 2008, the attention has been significantly shifted to another party, the third partner in the partnership, which is the financial sector. And the financial sector became crucial not only because it does provide the credit and does gives the money so that it makes the project possible to be implemented, but it does perform a continuous supervision over the project, and the supervision continues over decades or whatever the project, the contract, how long does it take, and well, yeah, full stop. Of course, these are the private actors that are the most controversial ones when it comes to PPP, and especially when it comes to PPP in security sector. The contradiction between the security interest and the economic interest is usually referred to as the main argument against implementing PPP solutions into security sector. However, the respondents we talked to tend to underline that there is a new business model emerging, or at least a need for a new business model that, well, in which the idea of shared responsibility for regional stability, for homeland stability, becomes kind of central. And the new business model is basically a result of two major reasons or factors. The first one is the very easy question that the businessmen or the entrepreneurs ask themselves, mainly, what will happen to my business if a school, if the shop, if the infrastructure will not be rebuilt or reconstructed or reopened after an earthquake or a hurricane. I will simply not make any money anymore. So I need to kind of involve in the responsible behavior. And the second factor is the growing expectation of the customers who expect the businessmen or the entrepreneurs to behave socially responsibly. When we have a look at the security sectors, as Buzan understands them, for example, we can see that actually none of the security sectors seems to be anyhow dominant when it comes to implementation of the PPP projects, with a slightly more open approach in the environmental sector, which is quite obvious because of the fact that the traditional security mechanisms kind of do not apply for the environmental sector. The research shows, though, that there are some fields or kind of security activities where the PPP projects can be implemented very successfully, or are even required to be implemented in order to achieve the goals assumed. And 4 of them seem to be very dominant. The first one is surveillance, where the private-public cooperation refers mainly to the governmental access to data provided by customers to private actors. The second one is critical infrastructure in Europe, where most of the critical infrastructure sites are privately owned in the region. The third one is fight against cybercrime, and the fourth one is research itself. The risks, challenges, and the obstacles related to the private-public partnership or cooperation can be basically categorized into three main groups: the political one, the legal ones, and the macroeconomic ones. And as it comes to the political ones, such obstacles can be named as the inconsistent strategies adopted by the individual states as well as on the regional level, the insufficiently encouraging experiences, the lack of understanding of the PPP mechanisms. However, this is the lack of transparency, of control, and of accountability that creates the very, very critical political challenge that is additionally strengthened by the fact that the PPP contracts are usually long-term contracts, and if they take for 20 years, for example, we have to experience, or we are experiencing some kind of political gambling when none of the government is actually responsible for the actions taken. As to the legal challenges, the research shows that it is not necessary for a country to pass a specific PPP law in order to introduce some PPP programs. However, obviously, a good law will encourage the partners and will create conditions that will make the projects or the cooperation more beneficial for all of the parties involved. And finally, the PPP projects, in terms of macroeconomic challenges, they are challenged by the obvious search for the balance between costs limitations and quality maintenance. Moreover, the transaction costs in PPP projects are usually very high. Sometimes they become so high that the project becomes unbeneficial for anyone. However, the most significant macroeconomic or most specific fiscal challenge is the fact that the partnerships are or can be excluded from the public books, which creates a possibility to hide actual costs and fiscal debts from the public books. And just to conclude it and close it with some more positive or optimistic considerations, the interviewees coherently underlined, which was actually to my great surprise, because some of them represent very conservative, traditional, militaristic, even security environments. But still, they all underline that an open and a well-developed cooperation between the public actors and the private actors is actually the only way to effectively manage the modern security environment. And the changing and the widening security model requires involvement of new actors and requires a new management model that can be cost effective, can be time effective, can guarantee easy and cheap access to expertise, and finally can result in share of good practices in such fields as, for example, green responsibility or gender equality. And let me just finish here, and we can get back to some points later on.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Ida. And thanks for all of you to sticking to the time, especially since we have quite a short discussion at this point. I will open the floor quite quickly. I'll just make a few remarks just before we do so. I mean, it seems like at least all of you have touched on this relation thing in between the private and the public relations within security relations. And some of you, especially I think Peter and Branka, you also brought into attention the role of civil society. And I think you brought up an interesting question about this difference between civil and non-civil society actors, and also the question of who do we consider to be the civil society, and what kind of positive, negative roles do they play. I think at least, most of you, Jelle, Ida, and Peter, at least you all touched on this role of the private security agencies, and the relations again between the private-public sphere and democratic accountability, and also the question of how much impact do the private players have in this field. I think especially Yellow, you touched on this aspect, and I think some of you also talked about this economic, financial aspect of things. And I think lastly, this I will mention this the role of the international kind of international community, and I think especially Branka and Yellow, you both brought up this issue in different ways in your papers about the role. I mean, I was thinking about the difference between the Northern Ireland and Bosnia in terms of having the international presence. What kind of difference does that make? And again, you brought up the kind of slightly, your argument was about the fact that the EU doesn't really have that much control, even though the national state also has less control now. So I think for this, I will just open the floor for questions. I don't know if there are any people who have questions for the panelists. Yes, so Sonia, I think yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to state out in defense of my own country, if nothing, that since December 1995, in my opinion, Bosnia and Herzegovina has been a safer place than Northern Ireland. Well, not because we have made some progress, but well, safer in all respects except for the standard of living and finances related issues such as social security, health care system, etc. But in terms of physical basic security, I think that it has been safer in Bosnia during these 18 years. But this is not because we have made such tremendous progress in this field. It is because of, in my opinion, two basic facts there. First of all, the communities aren't integrated anymore. They are territorially separated. Each of these separate police organizations that Ms. Marian mentioned is practically, or almost every of them, is controlled dominantly by one of the ethnic groups. Maybe there is one slight discrepancy there. Maybe they don't all fall into that category, but they are mostly controlled by one, respectively, by one ethnic group. And on the other hand, the process, the entire process in Northern Ireland was dealt with locally. Maybe this higher implication of the civil society was enhanced by the fact that in Northern Ireland the things were dealt with at home, locally, with the participation of the Republic of Ireland, of course, which in my opinion has been quite constructive given all the circumstances. So where are we when we introduce those two elements, those two indicators of the situation? Where does the comparison go from these two very important points, the territorial separation and the fact that in Bosnia and Herzegovina there is a tremendous and very important international presence and intervention in these matters? Thank you.
Maybe you should take a few more questions if you have. Are there any other questions at the moment?
Okay, I have a science fiction question. Many of the colleagues were talking about this reality of blurring the divide and symbiosis and noodle governance of security between a private, public, corporate, parastate, and so on. But one thing you had in common was this demand for reconstruction of state, as it deals with the topic of the Belgrade Security Forum, in its role as the main accountability actor. That was, I think, the argument shared by Mr. Linus and Mr. Gill. Both asked for more of a parliamentary oversight, more of a state role in regulation of accountability. And if we forget that I stand for an organization that defends the accountability of security sector and is in general agreeing with your point, just science fiction question. Is it worthwhile thinking of also noodle models or, you know, network models or different models of accountability where state is not, or competing accountabilities not just to the state, through the state structures, but maybe through different variants. Or we are taking for granted that it is only the state that can provide the most to the greatest number of people.
And it goes to all of them, or Sonia?
Jonathan and Mimi.
Okay, yep. Okay, maybe we should start then maybe with your question.
I'll address your question. It's a very good question, and I think anyone doing a comparison Northern Ireland and Bosnia should be prepared for it. So why sort of, yeah, I think you're entirely correct to say that in Bosnia there has been much more of an internationalized presence, and of course that has made a huge difference. But that was precisely my point. We've looked towards Northern Ireland as an example to be exported, right? So Christopher Patton, you know, he was later a representative of the EU, and he came to Bosnia and he looked at the police reforms and commented on them and stuff. And he was involved, sort of, they tried to kind of copy some of Patton's recommendations for Northern Ireland and Bosnia, but of course, as in the case of Northern Ireland, unfortunately for Patton's great recommendations, when it came to the follow-through, they weren't actually carried out in either case. In Northern Ireland, of course, Patton's kind of report shaped the way things developed, but when it came to the implementation, it was kind of implemented very lightly. But you have to, don't forget, in the case of Northern Ireland, the US plays a significant role. And the U.S. played a significant role in the conflict, whether it was informally, you know, in the bars in Boston where there were jars where you would put money for the cause back home, or, you know, so the U.S. has been significantly involved in both contexts, as has the EU. But of course the conflicts are different, and this is what makes these cases interesting, right? They're the most diverse cases, right? This is what makes them really interesting. Because the conflict in Northern Ireland was at such a lower scale than Bosnia's, you would expect so much more progress in certain things in terms of societal issues and reforms. But, you know, we can treat Northern Ireland as sort of police reform light, right? To the second point, what you are entirely correct in is, yes, Bosnia is currently segregated, essentially, in different, you know, it doesn't follow necessarily that in all cantons you have an ethnic, you know, group sort of being represented, but it certainly follows that you have an ethnic group that is the majority, and that, you know, you are policing this majority population, and the chances are very, very high that the individuals doing the policing are of that same ethnic group, right? So the sort of the police identities, of course, play a role as well. It would be very rare to have a police officer in Banja Luka, you know, who wasn't of Serb ethnicity and so forth. There is, I'm not saying there is no such cases, there are, but simply because of the population movements as a result of the conflict, this has remained. So yes, most of the violence in Northern Ireland does occur at the interface points, and what they mean by interface points is the points where the Catholic and Protestant communities meet, and I lived in one of these areas in North Belfast. So you will see a lot of the violence does occur there. So these are really important and crucial differences between these cases, that the Bosnian case has been so internationalized. But I think what some of my interviewees in Bosnia made the case for was that while we had this international presence, a lot of the reforms got done because there is little political consensus. And, you know, Bosnia is my country as well, so I can defend it and perhaps judge it more harshly. But a lot has been achieved, and I've said this, a lot has been achieved in Bosnia, but a lot needs to be done in terms of police reform. And when it comes to sort of this kind of community involvement, the trouble isn't only that, you know, the internationals were ones that carried out the reforms. That certainly is a part of the problem, because I think there has been sort of dependency that has been built towards the international community. So, you know, everyone in Bosnia feels like, well, you know, the internationals should solve it. The OHR, you know, he should solve it. Why isn't the High Representative solving this and that? And, so that relationship has certainly been built, and it's problematic, and it needs to sort of now kind of, as Bosnia heads towards, very, very slowly, in fact, and slowest in the region, towards European integrations, it will have to address also this kind of doing it by yourself, doing it at the local level. So I think fair enough, your points are fair, but I hope I've sort of answered your questions.
Yes, and I don't know if you want to start on the second question from Sonia.
For me, it is not the state that is the main accountability actor. It's Parliament, because only Parliament can be let's say, an adequate locus for deliberation and for an exchange of arguments, which cannot be offered by the media, which cannot be offered by civil society to that amount. So now there are some competing parliamentary assemblies. There is the European Parliament, there is the national parliaments, there is the West European Union Interparliamentary Assembly with NATO. So in fact, for me, another option would be not to consider the state as the main accountability actor, but strengthening parliaments at the appropriate level, not, let's say, at state level, but at European Union level or at NATO level, strengthening those parliaments and strengthening the cooperation between the two, between different levels. The problem is that now, for the moment, only national parliaments can offer the adequate locus for deliberation, because the European Parliament is still, European elections are still, let's say, second order elections. NATO Parliamentary Assembly, nobody, I won't say nobody cares, but yeah. So.
Okay, we have another 3 to 4 minutes, so if you want to just answer this, somebody else wanted to also answer this question from Sonia, and then I think we're going to have to leave it at that, I'm afraid. You had one question as well, yeah? Yeah. Sorry, which? Yeah, I thought that maybe if you wanted to also answer Sonia first.
Sorry, just on Sonia's point. Is it only, you asked, is it only states that can act in the public interest? I mean, my argument was partly, well, in one sense it is. It's the only collectively appointed or elected body that can act in the broader public interest, compared with the other two groups I was talking about, corporations who have a private interest, parastates who have also private and sometimes territorial interests. However, having said that, I would then want to strongly emphasise that if the two areas I know anything about, intelligence on the one hand, policing on the other, can we rely on state institutional forms of oversight? No, we can't. I mean, they frequently lack true independence, they lack resources, they may lack political will. And the role of civil society institutions, both nationally, regionally and transnationally, can be absolutely crucial. I mean, for example, to take the one case I mentioned, the big controversy around the US policy of extraordinary rendition and the possible UK collusion therein. It was reports from, for example, the Council of Europe done by Dick Marty. It was the operation of lawyers and civil society organisations such as Reprieve in the UK, and authors like Stephen Gray, you know, independent researchers. And it was out of that kind of entirely informal network that we found out what was going on. If we'd relied on the formal mechanisms, we would have learned nothing.
Okay, I think we can take one very, very quick question with a 1 minute answer from the gentleman down here, if you still wanted to.
I'd love it. My question is short, so.
Okay. So maybe you could take it with them afterwards then. Okay, thanks very much for attending, and thanks for the panelists for very interesting papers. Unfortunately, we didn't have much time for discussion, given that they have to prepare for this evening sessions and stuff. So I still hope that you got something positive out of this, and thanks very much for this whole academic part of the conference. So I think we will leave it with that. Thanks very much.